Hello everybody, today I am driving a Rover 45, and for somebody of my generation this is a very bittersweet experience. Back when this car was new, I was of exactly that age where I was becoming aware of not just the sporty, sexy and exciting cars that everybody knows about, but also the more mundane, more humdrum stuff, and I was slowly becoming aware that there were concepts such as humiliation which a young man could certainly experience. If at the right age I was perched in that back seat there, I can assure you the shame wizard was almost certainly going to pay me a visit. However, as time has moved on, I've learned things and I've matured as a person. I've realised that I probably misjudged Rover just a little bit, and I'm a firm believer that unless we face our prejudices, they will follow us around forevermore. So I am absolutely delighted to be driving a Rover 45 today. It's been supplied to me very kindly by its lovely owner Joseph Lloyd from the YouTube channel Lloyd Vehicle Consulting. Joseph is a very big supporter of mine, has been following the channel for a number of years and helped organise a few reviews for me. He's also responsible for introducing me to the wonderful world of Hubnut, and for that I will be forever grateful. What is most curious about this car is that if you took an impartial look at both it and the company, you'd struggle to realise why anyone would ever look down upon it. Rover is a brand that at many points in the past has been considered somewhat prestigious, and comparisons with Jaguars weren't always as silly as they may now seem. However, Rover was one of many companies that fell under the watch of British Leyland and suffered as a result. However, Leyland weren't entirely unaware of their shortcomings, and they knew they needed someone to help them keep the Rover brand going. At the same time, Honda was looking to expand operations into Europe, and so a match was made. Honda bought a significant portion of Rover, and what Rover got was a bunch of cars and technology that was actually pretty decent. And so for a very long time there was a fairly fruitful partnership, of which this was a result. And the genesis of this car actually started in 1992 with a little saloon called the Honda Domani. If you don't know what it is or what it looks like, you'd be entirely forgiven, because I'm not sure they were actually ever sold here. At that time, the mainstay of the Rover lineup was the 400 series, and in 1995 a new version was introduced based on the Honda Domani. It was in many ways a very fine thing. It inherited the Honda's double wishbone front suspension and multi-link rear, meaning it was both comfortable and competent in the bends. Though the interior and exterior were hardly amazing, they were acceptable for the time, and you must bear in mind that these weren't expensive cars. There was also a decent selection of engines available, and for the first few years it was actually a pretty good seller. In 1999 it was then facelifted to become the 45. The car looked significantly different. However, below the skin you would still find a then nearly 10-year-old Honda. And the 45 is far from a bad car. The facelift was relatively successful at disguising the aging underpinnings, however the interior didn't do quite so well. It's with the engines that things started to go a little bit wrong for Rover, because they had a selection of both petrol and a diesel engine. However, the smaller 4-cylinder petrol soon gained a reputation for head gasket failure, something that still haunts them to this very day. And then there was a range-topping V6, which is this. However, that V6 was a mere 2 litres in displacement, so produced a puny 150 horsepower, barely any torque, and even worse, was mated exclusively to a 5-speed automatic gearbox. In the rest of the Rover and MG lineup, this engine was a 2.5 litre unit. It was also seen in things like the Freelander, I believe. It made up to 190 horsepower in those and was a far better choice. Here, it's just strange. This car, unlike most, has a standard exhaust on it. I'm told this is a piece of unobtainium now. You can fit an MG ZS item, but to do so you need to cut the bumper, and that would feel like sacrilege now. Let's see what that engine will do if you want to rev it out. Not a lot is the answer. There is also quite a bit of wobble under braking in this car, but I was forewarned about that. It's got some fairly cheap pads and discs in it, and they are apparently the cause. But none of that is actually stopping me from enjoying driving this car. The steering's actually got a fairly pleasant feel. The ride is a little bit firmer than you might expect. I was kind of thinking it would be all sort of lollopy, but it isn't. It's actually a really nice blend between firm and sporty. Some reviews at the time criticised it for being a little bit too harsh, but as time progresses, our idea of what is firm and what is soft does change, and I think that's exactly what's gone on here.
In terms of practicality, front seat space is absolutely fine, headroom is reasonable, and the boot is excellent for a car in this class. Thanks to its underpinnings, the car's overall footprint is quite small. In terms of length, it's about the same as an E46 3 Series, however the width is the same as a first generation MX-5. Naturally, a compromise had to be made, and you'll find that in the back, where the seats look like they offer plenty of room, but they in fact don't. You will get adults in there, but they won't like it.
While everybody knew the 45 was built on a creaking old platform, the larger 75 was genuinely all new, developed with input from Rover's then new owners BMW, and the result was very good. Road testers really like the 75, and to this day I think it's probably one of the most underrated cars Britain has ever made. Even this, for its day, was still fairly well equipped. This is the top of the line Connoisseur V6, but there weren't really very many trim levels to choose from. And we have such luxuries as air conditioning, electric windows all round, power steering, okay, manual seats, but they are leather. I still remember very well the announcement that MG Rover was going to be shut for good. I think it would be unfair to say I was glad of it, but I certainly wasn't sad to hear the news either. And if you ask people why it is that the company failed, you're sure to get a whole host of different answers. Some might say that nobody really wanted to buy them anymore, that they were all still based on old Honda platforms, but that simply wasn't true. Others would tell you that BMW scuppered the brand. Famously, they'd purchased it a few years earlier, tried to do what they could, stripped out the Mini brand, which many suspected is what they were always after, and then sold it on for a tenner. As BMW had in their range some cars you could have considered a rival for the 75, but were also German, they produced a very natural villain for a lot of people. And so still to this day, many say it's BM that sank Rover. I welcome in the comments section any support of this theory, and I'm sure there's an element of truth to it. However, the fact is, BMW didn't exactly strip Rover naked and throw it out into the cold, because they did a lot to try and ensure that the company had a future, even going so far as to provide the new owners with a loan, interest-free, of over £400 million to help them develop the range and keep the company going. Indeed, news of the takeover was greeted with great enthusiasm by many, including those I'm sure who worked at the plant. But it was not to be. A few years later and the company was gone. And the sad thing is that the last few years of Rover were really very painful indeed, because the people that BMW had sold it to were a company called the Phoenix Consortium, and that turned out to be a rather inappropriate name. Dick Turpin would probably have been more accurate. Again, opinions may vary, but the general consensus seems to be that the people running the Phoenix Consortium essentially drained the entire thing dry. And when the company finally shut its doors a few years later, citing the fact it didn't even have the proverbial pot, the directors had been taking millions out. That's a story I'm sure you've heard before with regards to many other companies, and I've no doubt you'll hear it again. Effort was apparently made to try and keep the business profitable. They called it Project Drive. There's a few very helpful websites out there which detail all of the things that they did. Unfortunately, what they were really doing was simply taking all of the nice stuff out of the cars, and some of the changes were ridiculous. The removal of electronic switches, taking some badges off, I think keys lost, buttons, all sorts of stuff happened in the name of trying to make a few more pennies, which then were probably all going to go into the back pockets of these guys anyway.
The one good thing that came of the Phoenix shakeup was a temporary revival of MG. The ZR, ZS and ZT were products of the post-BMW era and showed the potential within the platforms and the company. Unfortunately, despite some of the cars actually outselling their Rover equivalent and being popular with both consumers and road testers, it still was not enough.
The ZT I've previously driven, because if you remember, they actually made one of those with a Mustang V8 in it and converted it to rear-wheel drive. The ZR was also the default choice for many a hooligan for a good half a decade, and even now I look back on those with a real fondness. The decline of MG Rover also coincided with the rise of the hatchback. They'd been around for decades already, but it was in the 1990s, I'd say, where the tides really turned and people stopped buying saloon cars by default and instead moved over to hatchbacks. The absolutely brilliant first generation Ford Focus certainly didn't help, and in fact, sales of the original 400 tailed off almost immediately as soon as that car landed. MG Rover did have hatchbacks in the range. They made a hatchback version of this, although it looked more like a sort of BMW compact type thing, like a shortened saloon, but there was also the genuine 25 ZR hatchback. However, that, as nice as it is, was a mile away from a first-gen Focus in just about every area that mattered to consumers, unfortunately. The closure of MG Rover only accelerated the process of these cars becoming extraordinarily undesirable. The truth is, you can still run and maintain one of these cars reasonably easily, but there are a few things you need to watch out for. As ever, in many ways, time has actually helped you, because a lot of the poorer examples are simply no longer about. There are plenty of buyer's guides out there on these cars, but the fact is they will nearly all have been run as fairly cheap examples for quite some time. So unless you've got a car that someone's already gone to the pain of restoring or recommissioning or simply looking after, do assume there's going to be a lot you'll have to do. Tyres, brakes, suspension components, bushings, so on and so forth. If you do want a V6, much like the MG ZS, of which I owned an example and loved, you'll find that the cam belts, there are 3, are all stuffed against the side of the engine bay. So to do those, it's about a 600 quid job. And when cars weren't even worth that much, that meant a lot of people were tempted to kind of skip those, and so a few did have failed engines. The thermostat housing is plastic and is known to explode, which is one of the reasons Joseph has lots and lots of coolant in the back of the car. And maybe as a result of its Honda underpinnings, or simply a coincidence, these also suffer from rust. Again, by now, most crusty examples will be fairly obvious, but assume nothing when it comes to these. As you may imagine, they're now a reasonably rare sight on the road. In terms of this specific trim level, apparently we're talking about double digits left in the UK. Yes, that is according to the notoriously inaccurate how many left, but I'm not sure we have any better method of measuring them. The dismal public opinion of Rover is such that even now, with classic and car prices in general at an all-time high, you'd still only have to pay £1,000 or £2,000 to get into a pretty decent example of a 45. And from where I'm sat, this really is a pretty decent car. The gearbox isn't the smoothest, but the overall driving experience is really pleasant. I love the steering, the brakes when sorted I know can actually be pretty decent. The car feels no more daunting than a Nissan Micra to place on a narrow road like this, and aside from one very high-pitched squeak which has only appeared recently, it actually is relatively free of creaks and rattles too. The most annoying things in here are the fact that this horrible, nasty, carpety stuff is just falling apart and the headlining is about to do the same, but otherwise, this is a perfectly fine motor car. There isn't anything about this car that makes you desperate to take it to the ragged edge. It seems most pleasant simply bimbling around. If you wanted a sportier drive, that was exactly what the MG ZS was for, and that was actually an excellent car. This is my Alpine handling route, and you know what? This is a riot to drive this car. It's not quick, it's really not, but it's damped really quite well for British B roads, and the steering, you just don't get cars that steer like this anymore. Not normal ones anyway. And so, for that exact reason, driving a Rover 45 remains a bittersweet experience. I no longer feel like I've got Shane Lizard next to me in the passenger seat, but I must confess I now have a slight anger directed towards the Phoenix Consortium, because I feel like my generation was robbed of an opportunity to experience a new generation of MG and Rover products that, if they were anything like the last ones, would probably have been quite good cars. So there we have it. There's a little trip down memory lane featuring a Rover 45 V6 Connoisseur. As it turns out, not the best car in the world, but certainly not the worst. That's it from me. A huge thank you once again to Joseph for bringing his car out. Thanks to you for watching. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.